Hello, AP Environmental Science students. Just wanted to go over the three different sets of notes that we had for this week. So starting off with the first one, which is introducing biodiversity. The first thing I want to go over is the difference between species evenness and species richness, because this is a question that came up a lot. So in this example here, we have two different communities. The reminder is species richness means the number of different species that we have in a community, where species evenness, refers to how evenly spread they are. So in this example, in community one, we have one, so elephants, lions, giraffes, hippopotamus, hyenas, and ibexes. So that's six different species. In community two, we have one, well, elephants, lions, giraffes, hippopotamus, ibex, hyenas. Six as well. So if we're looking at the species richness between these two communities, we would say that they have the same species evenness because they both, species richness because they both have six. When it comes to species evenness, however, as you can see, community one has way more elephants in its community, and it kind of dominates it, to whereas this one is pretty evenly spread out. There's either three or four in each community. So we would say that community two has more species evenness. So that's that first one. The next thing is which is better. So a question that came up is which is better to measure biodiversity, the richness or the Simpson's index for diversity. And it really depends on what you're looking at. If you're looking at the surface level, species richness is fine. If you want to get more in depth and see how that ecosystem is working, the index and that calculation works better. And another thing was asked is who uses these calculations? So obviously ecologists are going to use this when they're looking at different environments. Things like park rangers are also going to do it to see how healthy a park is, see what's going on. So they do calculations like this in lakes as well, so not just forest, as well as conservationists. So seeing how biodiverse is that ecosystem and what's going on with it. The last one from this set of notes was how has biodiversity changed over the years, which is a really good question, because it kind of gives us an idea of how we're doing, really. And the answer is way more complicated than it should be, but it kind of ebbs and flows throughout the millions of years that life has been on Earth, and it ebbs and flows with those extinctions. So there's been times where we've had really high biodiversity, and then times where we've had really low biodiversity due to things like extinctions. So it kind of when we see a drop in that biodiversity or a steep drop, it tends to tell us, oh, we might be heading towards something. And in 2015, the UN Conservation of Biological Diversity concluded that every day up to 150 species are being lost. And I know that seems like a really big number. And you're like, how can that many animals and that many species be going each day? Remember, that includes things like insects, things like bacteria, all living life are considered species. So keep that in mind. Moving on to the second set of notes, which was why is biodiversity important? What's going on with it? What are some of the benefits? And the big question that was brought out in this is what are these four categories and what's going on with them? And we'll go over that. But first, some people ask, well, what's the difference between natural services and ecosystem services? And again, really good question. For our natural services, just a reminder, these are processes that occur naturally in nature that support life and human economies. So that's things like air purification, stuff like that. Ecosystem services are things that benefit people. Are benefits that people obtain from ecosystems they live in. So you can think of natural services as being large scale stuff. So what's going on kind of in the planet, where ecosystem services are small scale. So our four categories, and breaking those down, just again to go over those, we have provisioning, we have regulating, we have cultural, and we have supporting services. So with our provisioning services, So these are products that are obtained from the ecosystem. So things like food and fresh water, the things that we eat, the things that we consume, provisions, regulating services. Um, these are the benefits that we obtain from regulation of the ecosystem. So things like regulation on climate. So things like albedo, reflecting sunlight back into space, the water cycle, and all that goes with regulating and making sure that some of that becomes fresh drinking water over time. Cultural services are the non-material benefits, things like spiritual enrichment, things like cognitive development, things like aesthetic experience. So the photo that's up of if you go outside and hopefully you did this weekend and see some of the beautiful colors that's around. Obviously, maybe you didn't go to Duluth, but just kind of going through these and just looking at that beautiful colors. These would be cultural services here. Things that are aesthetically pleasing, things that kind of let you clear your mind. Um, and last but not least is supporting services. And these are services that are necessary for the production of all other ecosystem services. So it's the supporting role. It's the IT of our ecosystem services. And this is things like biomass production, soil formation, nutrient cycling, water cycling, all that stuff. So again, kind of making sure that everything runs the way that it does. Last but not least is the last set, which is going over range of tolerance and island biogeography. Um, One of the things that came up where you guys wanted to say, well, what would possible answers be to those three questions that were posed? And we'll definitely go over them right now. Let me bring them up so that we can all look at them. So one of them was use this concept of edge effect to explain why boundary water canoe area wilderness strictly forbids any and all wheels, including small um, canoes, canoe carts within the park. And with the edge effect, remember that's saying that we can get pretty much like clumps of populations in one area and biodiversity in one area and places that don't have it. So it's kind of a boundary, a line where it's separating out different ecosystems and different parts of the ecosystems that species would live in. So with the boundary waters here, what they're trying to protect is making sure that that fragmenting of the ecosystem doesn't happen. So that's why they don't want to have things with carts in there. Another one was use the concept of island biogeography to write a strategy statement for an organization with limited funds that wants to maximize the effectiveness of when restoring native prairies. So something here, a strategy that you could say is making sure that you have large areas mandated for these natural prairies that are untouched. And we want large areas because we know that because of island biogeography, larger areas are more likely to be settled than small areas that are far away. So if you can make a big enough target, then we can think, well, hopefully that invites more things to grow, more biodiversity to be possible. And the last one was imagine two species that occupy the same trophic level, are roughly the same size, and exist roughly the same climate. Species A lives on a moderately sized island far away from shore, and species B lives on the mainland. Excuse me. Draw a generic range of tolerance for each of these species. So this one's harder for me to do because I don't have this in front of me. But we would expect, since they have the same trophic level and we have the same size and everything that's relatively the same, the only thing that's different is where they live, that these ranges of tolerance would pretty much be the same. If we're doing it for climate, they would live in temperature range that's the same. So say that that's maybe 10 degrees Celsius to 50 degrees Celsius. So it should look the same for both of those species, even though they're in two different places. Speaking of things like range of tolerance, some people had questions about that. Like, what does that look like? So what I did is I brought up a Minnesota well-known fish, a northern pike. And this is just kind of a wildlife handout thing that gives you some information. So what do they eat? What's going on? Things like that. The thing that I want to focus on, though, is the optimum habit requirements, because essentially this is the range of tolerance for our northern pike. So if we take something like temperature, for example, it's saying that the optimal temperature for northern pike in the water to live in is between 21 degrees Celsius and 26 degrees Celsius. So if we have that bell curve, most of it is going to fall within that range. You're going to have some that are outliers and that are on the very edges. So maybe 20 degrees, like 20 to 21 degrees on this side and 20 to 26 degrees. But most of them you're going to find somewhere in the middle, like 23, 24 degrees Celsius. We can also do that with pH. So the pH of the water that they like to live in is really, when you think of it, a pretty broad range of 5, a pH of 5 and a pH of 9. So something that can be a little bit more acidic and something that could be a little bit more basic, but it likes to live somewhere in the middle there. So again, that bell curve, you're going to see a higher amount of that population living in the area that would be like 6.5 to 7.5. And as you get closer to 5 on one end and 9 on the other end, you're going to see less and less of that population. So it's going to kind of even out. So yeah, say bye, northern pike. Then, last but not least, some people have talked about, well, what's this island biogeography? So, like I said in the other one, it's just saying, to boil it down into its simplest thing, is that if we have these areas where individuals can live, bigger areas. So, if we're talking about islands off the mainland, bigger islands are going to have more species, a greater amount of biodiversity than, say, if you had a small island that was right next to it that was the same distance away from the land. Because, like I said, it's a bigger target to hit. And as we go further out, so if you have a really small island that's really far out, you're only going to expect to see a couple of different species. Whereas you have a larger island that's really far out, you're still going to not expect to see a whole bunch because of the distance, but you would think that it would have more than the small one. Because if you think of, like, if I gave you something and you were just blindly throwing it out there, are you more likely to hit a target that's small or a target that's large? So you can kind of think of it that way. And we will go over that. We're actually going to do a lab after MEA that's going to talk about that, which I think is a lot of fun. But again, I'm a science teacher, so what do you expect? Yeah, so that does it for this kind of clarification. If your question did not get answered, please reach out to me. That's what I'm here for. But other than that, I know this is a little bit later than I said it was going to be, but hey, I got it out there. Hope that you all are enjoying your weekend, and I will see you later. Bye.